Hello everyone, welcome to another video. My name is Ryan Rot and I am a vintage t-shirt collector and reseller. For the past 10 years, I've personally collected, traded, and resold thousands and thousands of 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s t-shirts. I love it, it's a passion of mine, and in today's video, we're gonna talk about something that is dreaded in the vintage t-shirt community, and that is called dry rot. So what I figured we could do for today's video is I've broken down dry rot into chapters. In the first chapter, I want to talk about what even is dry rot as it relates to vintage t-shirts, because outside of vintage, it's something completely different. But as related to vintage t-shirts, dry rot means something in particular. In chapter 2, I want to talk about how to test your t-shirts for dry rot. I have some examples in front of me that are dry rot, and I'm going to show you exactly what the best way is to test your shirts for dry rot. In chapter 3, I want to talk about, is there a cure for dry rot? If your shirt has dry rot, if it has deteriorated over time, is there a way to bring it back to life? And then in chapter 4 of this video, in the final part, I'm gonna go over 5 or 6 common misconceptions when it comes to dry rot. The point of this video is to help educate future vintage buyers and vintage sellers. I really hope this information helps out. Before we jump into today's video, this is not sponsored, by the way. I just want to give a shout out to Defunct. That's where this t-shirt came from. They are a vast resource for all things vintage. I did a lot of my research on dry rot on their website. They have extensive articles on that website about dry rot as well. And honestly, they're just really good people. That website's been around forever and it's a really, really cool resource. So go check out Defunct. I'll put a link to their website in the description of today's video, but nothing but respect for the Defunct team. Okay, so chapter number 1, what is dry rot as it pertains to vintage t-shirts? So in the 90s, t-shirt manufacturers, the companies that actually produced and dyed the t-shirts, they started to switch over to a different type of black dye. When they dyed their black t-shirts, they were using a cheaper version of the dye they used to dye their shirts. Now, unfortunately, what they didn't realize is that the dye that they were using was a sulfur-based dye. And what happens is if you dye a t-shirt black with that particular dye and you don't wash it, you don't wash out that sulfuric dye, eventually over time, over years and years and years, that sulfur becomes acidic and it starts to break down the cotton fabric of that t-shirt. So it's not rot in the typical sense. It's not from moisture, it's not from mold, it's from the actual dye that was used that was sulfur-based. So again, the easiest way to think of this is in the black dye they used to dye the t-shirts. If they didn't wash it out, or if you got a shirt and you never washed that dye out and it just sat around for years, it's gonna break down and deteriorate the cotton integrity of the shirt so that when you pull on it, it rips very easily. So some telltale signs of dry rot. Now, I've personally only ever seen dry rot in black t-shirts. I'm not saying that it can't be found in other color shirts. I just have personally only ever seen it in black t-shirts. But some telltale signs. Sometimes the fabric will look shiny. It'll have like a sheen to it. Sometimes there'll be like a sweet smell. So that's very common when the shirt is heavily dry rot. When the fabrics are very, very deteriorated and weak. If you smell the shirt, it'll smell almost like maple syrup. It's delicious. It smells like pancakes. And then sometimes if you feel the fabric of the shirt, it'll feel kind of scratchy, right? And if the shirt is very dry rot, sometimes if you just touch it like that, you'll actually get some fabric and dye on your fingertips. If you just give it a little pinch like that, sometimes it'll just automatically come off on your hands. So that brings us to chapter number 2 of this video, which is how do you test for dry rot? And I have some examples to show you of some t-shirts that are unfortunately dry rot. Now, with the thousands and thousands of shirts that we've had over the past years, we've probably had, I don't know, at least a couple hundred dry rot shirts. It is terrible when they come, but we always test our shirts just in case they have dry rot. And these two actually came in yesterday. Fortunately, the seller is a friend of mine and we're working with each other to fix the situation. But let me show you a couple examples of dry rot shirts. So the first one I'll show you is this 1990 Slayer piece. So this is a very early version of dry rot. Typically, you're not gonna see dry rot on 80s t-shirts. It's gonna be 90s up until like early 2000s. Here's the way that I test dry rot shirts. Now, you could probably take this shirt and rip it in half fairly easily, but a lot of people still collect these shirts. They're still resellable. If they're wearable and washable, people will still wear them. I have dry rot shirts in my collection that I'm careful with how I wash and wear, but I still wear them all the time. And there's also people that just want the graphic. They'll take the graphic and cut it out and put it on something else, or they'll frame it like a piece of artwork. So what I do to kind of still protect the integrity of the shirt is you go either under the sleeve hem, or what I like to do is under the bottom hem. So I'll take the shirt and go to the bottom hem and then the back of the shirt. And on the bottom hem, there's 2 layers of fabric. So if you separate the fabric into 2 separate pieces, and then you just take your fingers and you pinch that fabric, and you just give it a nice little pinch and pull. If it tears like that, it is unfortunately dry rot. Now there's different stages of dry rot depending how long the dye has been in the shirt. This shirt has been washed before, right? But unfortunately, the fabric has already deteriorated. But again, there's different levels to dry rot. So sometimes it'll literally rip like a piece of paper, and sometimes you'll have to put some effort into it to get it to rip. But if it rips like that, it is dry rot. I'll give you a quick example. Actually, yesterday I was at a Goodwill thrift store and I found this beautiful elephant shirt, and it was just so cool, this 90s elephant shirt. But it was a black shirt. I could tell it was brand new. The dye was still fully in it. And when I gave it just a teeny tiny tug, it shredded like a piece of paper. So that one was way far gone, dry rot. This shirt here is still wearable. Like I said, you would just have to be careful about how you wash it and how you wear it. Now, other than the pinch test, if you can't do that, if you're not comfortable with that, the other way to test it, which is, it's an easier way if you have never tested a dry rot shirt before. If you just take the seam, either the sleeve or the hem seam, and you pinch the fabric between your fingers, so you don't have to separate the fabric. Just pinch it between your fingers and try to tear it like a piece of paper. See that? Pinch it between your fingers, tear it like a piece of paper, and if it rips like that, the shirt is dry rot. Here's another example. This 1990 Danzig shirt is unfortunately dry rot. I'm gonna do the same thing here. I'm gonna go underneath the hem, separate the fabric, give it a little tug. And this one's actually in better condition than that one, but it is still ripping, unfortunately. You can actually see if you rip it like that, you can get some fabric off on your fingers. Okay, so chapter number 3. Now that you know what dry rot is there a cure for dry rot? Well, as of January 16th, 2024, there is not a cure for dry rot. There's no way to reverse it. Once the sulfur, the acid has eaten away at the integrity of the cotton fibers, there's no way to bring it back to where it once was. Now that being said, there are some things you can do to kind of mitigate dry rot from getting worse. If you get a shirt and it's dead stock meaning the shirt has been sitting around for years, it's never been washed, it's never been worn. It's just as it was like if you were to go buy it in the 90s, it's never been worn. It is dead stock. It's brand new old stock, whatever you want to call it. In vintage, we call that dead stock. If you come across a shirt like that, it's more than likely going to be dry rot. But how you can kind of stop the dry rot from getting worse is by washing the shirt. You need to get the dye, as much of the dye out of that shirt as possible. That's not gonna stop it from being dry rot. It is already dry rot, but that'll stop it from continuing to get worse. And then I've also seen some people do some other neat things, like they'll actually cut the graphic out that they want, and they'll transfer it over to a donor t-shirt that is not dry rot. And they'll just stitch the graphic onto the actual shirt itself and basically make a new shirt out of a dry rot graphic. And then the other cool thing that I've seen done is people, again, will take the graphic and they'll frame it and make it into artwork. Because some of these graphics are still really cool and you can preserve them as artwork. I've seen people take big frames and they'll put the shirt in the middle and then put like some concert material, some ticket stubs and like some backstage passes, and they'll make it look like really cool, and you can take that and hang it up in your office or something and still appreciate the shirt. If it's not wearable, you can use it as art. Hopefully this video is helping so far. Again, this video is not meant to call anybody out. This video is just meant to educate, to help people who don't really understand what dry rot is, to help them not become a victim of buying a dry rot shirt or accidentally selling a dry rot shirt. But now what I want to do is talk about some common misconceptions when it comes to dry rot. The first one I hear often is that only 90s t-shirts can be dry rot. Absolutely not true. I've seen up to like 2005, I think, is the latest one that I've seen to be dry rot. I currently have a Stone Cold shirt from 2002 that is dry rot. And I think a lot of that is just leftover 90s blanks. They were using the same dye. Some of it is like they were using the dye up until the 2000s, but some of it I think is they were printing on old blanks that were left over from manufacturers making and dyeing all these shirts. And then companies get those older blanks, print on them, and then that dry rot continues on. Now, I personally haven't seen any dry rot earlier than 1989, but I'm sure it exists. Like the two examples I showed you were 1990 shirts. So I'm sure there's blanks that were made, you know, in the 87, 88, 89 that were printed on that are dry rot. So 80s dry rot shirts I'm sure do exist. Another misconception that I hear a lot is that once a shirt is dry rot, you can't wash it anymore. Not true. Dry rot is a scale, right? So it can be very, very dry rot, unwearable. If you put it in the washing machine, it's gonna deteriorate and fall into pieces. All the way up to like, you gotta really tug at it to get it to rip. It is still very, very wearable. Like I said, I have shirts in my closet that are dry rot that I wear often, and I wash them normal. They'll go in the washing machine, hang to dry, and they're fine. I could wear them like normal and wash them as much as I want. Another one I hear often is that dry rot shirts have no value. That one is absolutely not true. Take these two shirts that I showed you earlier, the Danzig and the Slayer. These are still wearable shirts, or I can sell them as artwork. They have some value to them still. Now, I will say when a shirt is dry rot, it usually does drastically reduce the value of that shirt. You're not gonna get like full value for the tee, but just because it's dry rot doesn't mean that it has no value at all. You shouldn't just throw that shirt away. You can still sell it, you can still use it as artwork, and someone out there still will buy that shirt. A prime example of that is I had a Mike Tyson shirt that was dry rot, but like very, very early stages. You had to tug pretty hard at it to get it to rip. And that shirt in dry rot condition, I resold for $600. That's because it's a very valuable shirt already, and now someone can get it, a little bit of dry rot, early stages dry rot. They can get that shirt for a heavy discount that they can still wear. They're getting, you know, $400 or $500 off the top end price of that shirt, but it still has value. Ooh, here's one that I hear all the time. Faded t-shirts cannot be dry rot. Not true. Like I said earlier, once a shirt is dry rot, that is it. If you wash the dye out of it, if you take like dye removal and you put that on the shirt and you wash all the dye out of it, the integrity of the cotton is gone. The acid has eaten away at the cotton, and just because a shirt has a fade doesn't mean that it can't be dry rot. Perfect example, I have a vintage Kurt Cobain long sleeve shirt that I wear all the time. It's a great shirt, but it's dry rot. It has a crazy fade to it, but it's dry rot. So just because a shirt is faded doesn't mean that that shirt cannot have dry rot. And then the last little misconception before I move on to some final thoughts is there's a big difference between a thin t-shirt and a dry rot shirt. So here's one of my personal tees, the Motley Crue 80s shirt. You can see it's very thin. It is very, very thin. It's very faded. Because this shirt is so thin, if I was to really pull on this fabric, it's gonna rip. That doesn't mean that it has dry rot. It just means that in the 70s and 80s, they made shirts thinner. A lot of them were made with a 50-50 cotton blend, thinner, smaller, and over time with wear and age and wash, they become very, very thin. So just because a shirt is thin and you can tear it, that doesn't mean that it's dry rot. That just means that you have to handle that shirt with more care. And then just to close some things up with some final thoughts, I will say there are some manufacturers of t-shirts from the 90s that I have never found dry rot on. In particular, 90s Fruit of the Loom tags. I'll pop up an example and I'll show you one of my Fruit of the Loom shirts, a black t-shirt. I have never found dry rot on that tag. There's other t-shirt manufacturers like Stanley DeSantis, for example, that I have had 40 Stanley DeSantis shirts be dry rot when I got them before. So some companies were using that particular dye, other companies didn't use that dye, which is probably why that Fruit of the Loom blank specifically I've never seen with dry rot. And then once again, they didn't sponsor this video, but shout out Defunct. I love this shirt, Death Before Dry Rot. I don't even know if they still sell this shirt, but if they do, go to their website, support them, go buy a t-shirt, and go check out their website. And again, I hope this becomes a resource for people to understand a little bit more about what dry rot is, what causes it, and how to test for it. If this video did help you, please do me a favor, hit the thumbs up button, and consider subscribing to the channel for more information just like this. Thanks everyone, I appreciate you, I love you, I'll see you in the next one.